So we're going to start with Austin Gillette, who is with us virtually. I'm going to turn the time over to Austin, and then after Austin, then the four discussants, if you could come up here, and Austin will be able to see you. And then they're going to critique Austin's paper, and then when that's done, we'll have the other three in turn come up. So why don't we have Heather, Kelly, and then Sierra Davis and Claire Willardson come up in turn, and then after that, the discussants will come up and critique each of their papers. So, Austin, you ready?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Great. Thanks everyone for being patient with my cyber intrusion. So I assume you can see my PowerPoint. Let me know if you can't. So the title of my presentation is Between Citizens and Strangers on Laïcité among Hmong residents of France. I should say that this presentation comes from research conducted in the summer of 2016 in a small village in the Loire Valley in France. And this town attracted the attention of one of our anthropology faculty members because in the late 1970s, dozens of Hmong families were relocated there after the Vietnam War. And today, around 50 families still live there, and they constitute a small but conspicuous percentage of the population. So I'll start with the story of this man in the upper right-hand corner. His name is Jean Fillon, and he was the mayor of this town for more than 2 decades. He was instrumental in the resettlement or acclimation of these families to the community. And when I first met this man, I immediately recognized him because this picture hangs in the houses of so many of the Hmong families. So I knew exactly who he was, and I knew how they felt about him. He was instrumental in establishing sources of funding for them, building a clubhouse, securing land. He even helped elect a Hmong man to the community council. So an interesting piece of his story is that after his tenure as mayor, Fillon was elected to serve as a member of the French National Parliament. And in 2004, he voted with the overwhelming majority to pass a controversial resolution that banned the wearing of conspicuous displays of religious clothing or symbols in French public schools. So you might have heard about this. It attracted a lot of international criticism and media attention because it effectively banned young Muslim schoolgirls from wearing their headscarves while at school. And this ban was kind of one piece of a large legislative project known as Laïcité. And it's been described as sort of an abstraction where those that enter France must check their religion and their culture and their language at the door and adopt an allegiance to French nationality that sort of transcends all other identities, religious or cultural. So I was struck with this difference. On the one hand, Fillon is celebrated for his treatment of this minority population in his town, while on the other hand, he voted to restrict the religious expression of another minority group. So my time spent in Le Château was spent examining this local flavor of laïcité and how it differs from secularism broadly with regards to the Muslim French. So the laïcité as I saw it, or secularism, did not result in religious abstraction, cultural suppression, or group right infringement. On the contrary, the policies enacted by the government maximized religiosity and encouraged factionalized group solidarity, increased Hmong representation in the local government, facilitated passive coexistence, and de-emphasized French identity. So for the sake of time, I'll focus on just 2 examples of governance, of this pattern of governance cited above, specifically how rather than de-emphasizing Hmong group solidarity. The local politicians encouraged it by reliving the terms of the Hmong arrival in France. So I'll start with this. In July, in the city of Le Chateau, the city hosts a Franco-Scottish festival where they acknowledge the history of fraternity between early Scottish and French residents of the town. And the festival culminates in a parade attended by thousands of people from within France and throughout Europe. Last year, so here's a picture of some of the things that happened in the parade where they reenact sort of the history. Last year, or in 2016, holding up the unlikely rear of the procession was this tight grid of Hmong residents of the town. Here they are dressed not in Scottish garb, but in their Hmong costumes, their traditional Hmong outfits, and playing their reed instruments. So you can imagine after watching nearly a mile of these Scottish actors and people marching in the parade, these Hmong residents kind of stick out. So the fact that the Hmong residents are celebrated for their unique clothing starkly contrasts with French policies in other cities banning Muslim headscarves. In Le Chateau, I argue that there's no attempt to delegitimize or even de-emphasize cultural or religious otherness as expressed in costume. Another instance of this kind of disinterest to reduce group cohesion is the Hmong Festival. It's a Hmong organized event celebrated a few weeks after the Franco-Scottish Festival. This year, thousands of Hmong from France and other countries gathered in a soccer field a mile or so out of town to celebrate Hmong culture and identity with vocal and dance performances and sort of handicraft selling, things like that. During the opening ceremonies, Pierre, the president of the Hmong Association, welcomed a speech from the current mayor, Amandine Judah. In her speech, she begins by outlining the history of the Hmong in Le Chateau and how they have been able to create a place for Hmong culture to thrive despite being in a foreign country. She continues in this quote, "You have been chased from your land. You know better than anyone of the importance of roots. And every year you do us the honor and the pleasure of participating in our Franco-Scottish festival that recounts the history of Le Chateau. Each year you march in the parade with your magnificent traditional costume that we see today. You are always welcome here in our home. Long live the Hmong Festival 2016. Long live the Hmong." So this speech was striking to me for a few reasons. The first is the striking, or is sort of like the explicit recognition of historical and cultural roots. Cynics of laïcité would say that the purpose is to reduce those roots, reduce them if they could be seen as potentially conflicting with French identity, because a French citizen is just that, a French citizen. So Mayor Judah demonstrated the willingness to prolong the relationship that they first cultivated when the Hmong refugees first arrived in the late 1970s. And I argue that the salience of this speech and other speeches that I won't have time to talk about, the salience comes not from paying respect to the Hmong visitors, but in the way that it reinstantiates the terms of the Hmong arrival in France. It serves as an annual review of the continued Hmong residency in France. And the second reason that I think this is interesting is this is a time for the Hmong community to recognize, or the French community to recognize the Hmong community as a distinct cultural group. She's talking here about not sort of the French community, but the French community within which the Hmong community exists. So I'll summarize quickly. Recent scholarship characterizes secularism broadly and laïcité specifically as a project of governmental control where the state kind of dictates the terms of minority cultural and religious involvement in public life. And they do this by legislating an abstraction of the citizenry where cultural or religious baggage is reduced to emphasize the supremacy of French citizenship. And I argue that outside of the Muslim context and among the Hmong refugees with whom I spent my time, the governmental control did not amount to an abstraction or an effort to reduce communitarianism. On the contrary, these Hmong refugees were celebrated as minority groups and granted many rights that the French national government refuses to recognize for minority groups nationally. In an interview that I did with one of the first 3 Hmong men that arrived in Le Chateau in the late 70s, I asked him to describe his relationship with the French, and he said, quote, "I am 80% French. Despite owning a French home and paying French taxes and working in a French company for nearly 4 decades, he feels like he doesn't wholly identify as French." And my claim is that this man's admission of partial Frenchness is brought about, at least in part, by local governmental policies that amounts to a distance between Hmong residents of the town and unadulterated French citizenship. So the French citizen, or the Hmong citizens, their status here is an oxymoronic one, where they're both guests and permanent fixtures. They're strangers and neighbors. Thank you.
First, just a few comments. I really enjoyed the paper. Some nice work. A very strong research project, and I think it brings up very interesting points about France and its treatment of minority or ethnic minorities, religious minorities within France. As you pointed out, has become quite controversial given the sort of uniform objective treatment of Muslims in France. So what I think one of your strongest contributions is that it sort of challenges this notion that France has a uniform, universal policy in treating its ethnic and religious minorities. So I think your work brings up a very important point that France has no uniform policy because the Hmong in France, as you pointed out, are celebrated, whereas Muslims are definitely targeted to be less, or to be more French and less Muslim. So I think you bring up a good point. And there you could even expand it, I think. I didn't get to read your full paper, but I wonder if, I wonder if this complicates a post-colonial context in France. So for instance, if you look at Paul Gilroy and post-colonial melancholia, that all the chickens are coming home to roost, so to speak. That's not necessarily the case. We don't have a uniform policy. We have something that's much more complicated. And the second point I want to make is, I'm looking at the quote from the mayor where you quote him saying, he's taking care of Hmong because France has a debt to pay. I want to say that even though Hmong are being celebrated in France, I think that's not necessarily without politics, or it's not necessarily, it doesn't have a negative connotation. So that quote itself, taking care of Hmong, is burdened with paternalism. Like he's taking care of somebody, he's in a position to be a parent to them. And also that France has a debt. There's a lot of, this resonates with the call of white man's burden in some ways, that France has a debt to take care of its children almost. So I'd like us to be a little more critical about that statement. And here I'm even thinking about the United States and this treatment of people of color, and if you look at the model minority, so white citizens of the United States sort of elevate the model minority to be just that, the model for other people of color or minorities to be. I wonder if France is following a similar pattern to hold up the Hmong to say, if you behave like this, we will treat you like this, or here's a model for other people, specifically Muslims, to follow. So really good project. Just want to encourage you and perhaps develop it in those ways too.
Great, thank you.
I enjoyed hearing you discuss this very much. It sounds like a very exciting research project. My area is primarily public policy, so of course I was struck by the fact that they tried to increase Hmong representation at the local, the increased Hmong representation in the local government. So I wondered if that's a way of integrating the Hmong into the French identity. And so I wondered if you could explore a little bit further the differences between the Hmong being integrated and the Muslims being integrated. And so I enjoyed reading this as a reviewer. I often send my papers out for review, and I often find it hard to get the comments back. You know, your first thought is, oh my goodness, there's so many things I need to change. But then as I think about it, I learned from those. That feedback, and so I think the more information you're able to forward to the discussants, the easier it is for them to give you helpful feedback.
Right.
So, yeah.
Great, thank you.
So it sounds like hopefully everything's okay over there.
Sorry, can you hear that?
Yeah.
I'll try to cover that.
Life's not coming for you.
No, I'm in New York City, so I just don't even notice it anymore.
So I also wanted to say thank you for your paper. I enjoyed it a lot. I thought it was really interesting and relevant. Very good contemporary topic that I think we can all relate to. So these sort of connections between culture and place and identity and belonging and who belongs in places. So I'd like to encourage you to connect your case study to what's happening in other places and maybe some of the larger global trends and themes that come out of your work, such as government power and policy versus identity, nationalism versus citizenship, and perhaps think how does this case study connect to other things happening in other parts of the world, including here in the States. Also, I thought it was interesting how you talked about how this encouraged a reaction and then also further reaction. So you see, you might want to look at what's happening in France today and how there's further reaction on the political scene with people fragmenting into right and left camps and so on. So it might be interesting to put it within that political context. And perhaps think about what does culture mean and what is culture. So is culture more than perhaps costumes? And what does tokenism mean? So is there perhaps an element of just letting people show their national costumes as a form of tokenism without really granting a form of a citizenship or a national identity? And you might be interested also in Anthony Aiken's work, and he looks at cosmopolitanism and what does that mean today. So within the larger human community, he looks at the local in connection to the international or the human community as a whole. So a few things to think about, but I thought it was really excellent. So well done.
Great, thank you.
Byron here. Yeah, great job. I guess one of the things that I'm most interested in is the old argument of secularism. And I think you're right to tackle this as an issue, and also the issue of religious freedom. Both are really important, and there's a lot of good research now showing that 3/4 of the world's population lives in countries where there are severe religious restrictions placed on people who believe, and this goes across the board in terms of different kinds of faith traditions. So the fact that you find Muslims being persecuted for the way they dress is interesting. It's certainly not an isolated thing, but it doesn't get enough attention. One of the things that I would encourage you to do is to, I'm not sure how much time you plan to spend there, but it would be great to do something over time to see what happens. My sense is that the secularism argument fails ultimately, and there are some fascinating examples like Russia, where for 70 years the government tried to eliminate religion, and there's a great book out called The Plot to Kill God about the Russia experience by Paul Froese. and I think that you'd find it interesting reading. And of course, if you look at China, what's happening now is a veritable explosion of religion with a 9% growth trajectory curve in China. Now more Christians exist in China than communists, and people think by the year 2030 it'll be the most populated Christian country in the world, in spite of the persecution. So, you know, you're tapping into something that I think is absolutely fascinating. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah. So you can stay there or you can go back.
I'm going to at least mute myself, but thanks everyone for your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Austin.
Also, you'll see I'm looking at discussing religion as well, but much more from an interpersonal level, whereas Austin talked about a lot of these issues from a macro level. I'll be focusing on a more interpersonal level. And so to start out, I'm a family science major. I'm doing a master's program right now in marriage, family, and human development here. And I studied religion and family life. And up until about 2000, there was not a great deal of good research on the nexus of religion and family life. But the research has made great strides in the past years, but started off mainly focusing a lot more on the positive aspects, the positive outcomes of religion on family lives. And religion has often been measured by very simple constructs such as just attendance or religious salience. But in recent years, they've made a lot of strides towards looking at religion from a more complex lens and seeing how religion is both helpful and harmful in family lives and other relationships. So Dahlheit et al., they recently published a conceptual model of 8 different dualities that kind of happen at the nexus of religion and family life, and that help explain to us how religion can be something that is so helpful for some, while also being so harmful for others. And one of the dualities that they introduce is that religion is both relationally unifying and relationally divisive, and that's the duality that this paper looked at in depth. And as a religious scholar and rabbi stated, this is Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, he said, "Groups unite and divide. They divide as they unite. Every group involves the coming together of multiple individuals to form a collective us. But every us is defined against the them, the ones not like us. Inclusion and exclusion go hand in hand." So while I am a family science is my focus, and while this model that Dahlheit et al. Published was focused on specifically relationships within the family, I wanted to look a little bit at relationships both within the family as well as outside the family, because of this idea that, you know, unity within the family might be at the cost of division in other relationships outside of the family. So using a large qualitative sample, we had interviews from 198 religious families, which was 476 individuals, and these families were from the 3 Abrahamic faiths, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And there was an intentional oversampling of racial and ethnic minorities. And we used this data set is over 4,200 pages of single-space data, so lots of great data there. And we use a rigorous coding, team coding approach to code this data. And we identified about 2,200 unifying references or narratives and around 1,400 divisive narratives. And then we further classified these narratives regarding what relationship was being unified or divided. So was it familial, congregational, interfaith, or relationships between like the religious and those in their secular communities is how we looked at it. And here it kind of shows, so the prevalence of these results. So as far as unifying narratives went, we by far had the fewest in the secular community and the most in the family and congregational relationships. And then it was the opposite for the divisive narratives. There were the fewest divisive narratives in the families, within the families, and the most between the religious families and individuals and their secular communities. And again, this is looking at the relationships of highly religious families. And so I think we'd see a lot of difference here if we were looking at a different sample. But again, looking at those relationships, this is what we found with how religion affected their relationships. So, as I mentioned before, most of the research has focused primarily on more of the positive outcomes of religion, and the project and the data that I'm working with, it was also, the interview questions were more strengths-based, positive approach, and so there's just been a lot of focus on all the positive outcomes of religion. And I myself, as a religious person, we have some predisposed bias to see all the positive things that come from religion and the positive outcomes. So as a deliberate counterbalance to those biases, I have spent a great deal more time analyzing and looking at these divisive narratives. And due to time and space constraints of the paper, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the divisive narratives, how religion was divisive for these highly religious families. And so I'm going to give you now just a few of the results and some really quick snippets of the actual data of what these families said regarding how religion was a divisive force. So within the family, most of the divisive narratives were surrounding time. So how religion took the family members away from each other, and how they had so many different responsibilities due to their religion, and how that was hard for some of these families and just took them apart, as well as differing levels of religious orthodoxy or observance. Those were what most of the immediate family narratives were about, whereas when we looked at some of the narratives between family members and their extended family, those got a little more conflict and judgment in some of those narratives, particularly when family members were of different religious, or sects than their other family members. So here are a couple of narratives. As one Christian father said, this one captures that time element. He said, "By giving up so much time with the church, sometimes you sacrifice your family. Sometimes they are left out because you're spending so much time in the church, your home is getting left behind." The second one captures that extended family balance. It's a Jewish mother talking about when her parents come over. She said, "When my parents visit here over Shabbat, which they've done sometimes, and it looks to them like the most boring thing you could possibly do." So, and she went on to say more about how that caused an issue. The parents didn't enjoy this ritual that was so important and central to their family, and it was something that her parents couldn't appreciate. So moving to the congregation, most of these regarded differing levels of orthodoxy between members. So just kind of making these comparisons of, we're a lot more active, we participate a lot more, we volunteer more than other people. And so a lot of them were just dealing with that. Some more divisive examples included conflict between religious members and their leaders, as well as some disagreements on doctrine, particularly some more controversial doctrine. If we brought up, things like birth control among Catholics, that can be something that was very divisive between members of the congregation. So this is just a quick quote regarding different levels of observance. A Christian father said, "Well, most of the families we know aren't as religious as us," speaking of the families within his congregation. Moving on to the interfaith relationships, these accounts were mostly just people comparing themselves and the differences they had in their beliefs and practices. And this first one we see a little bit more, was a little more divisive. They use strong language. They say, "I hate groups that are based on we're better than you are. We hate Protestants who hate blacks and Jews." And so some of these were also, we moved a little bit. Right here you can see this isn't necessarily focused on those interpersonal relationships, but it's these generalizations that people have that affect and prevent them from cultivating more interpersonal relationships with these people of different faiths. And here, the second one is just another broad comparison. This is a Jewish mother, I believe, saying, it's easy to be Jewish, it is difficult to be Christian. So just kind of differences, again, that us and them, that religion is kind of making that distinction between. All right, so with the secular community, again, this is where we had the most divisive narratives. Well, about 3/4 of the narratives were more of just these differences, kind of, just the us and them that kind of happens when you have different lifestyle, different culture. The remaining quarter were much more divisive. These were narratives where the religious individuals perceived that they were being judged, ostracized, and those had a much more divisive, conflicting tone to them. But not all of the divisive narratives are negative in nature, and that's something I want to point out with these first two narratives. These are both from Jewish youth, and the first one I think is a young Jewish man, and he said, being Jewish is very special, and we're different, and I kind of like that a little bit, and I'm willing to make sacrifices so I can be Jewish. So here we see that this young man viewed these differences and kind of this division, this how he was separated from others, as being a very positive thing. Whereas the second one is a 17-year-old Jewish girl, and she said, the strongest sort of challenges come from when you feel being Jewish isolates you from your friends or isolates you from the surrounding area, or that having any sort of strong faith isolates you. So again, I like how those kind of compare and contrast. We have two young people, both from the Jewish faith, and we can see for one of them, he viewed the division that religion was bringing in his life as through a positive lens, whereas this second one, it was a real struggle for her. This last narrative shows that kind of is a sample from that quarter of more divisive narratives. This was very common with parents concerned for their children because of their religion. So I believe this is a Muslim mother or father who said this: our kids already do so many things differently because of our faith. It's really a challenge to them because they already feel so ostracized in that sense. So in conclusion, over 300 of those total narratives were coded as combined, being both unifying and divisive. And I think that this estimate is actually a little bit low just because of how we did the coding. We had divisive coded separate and unifying codes coded by different coders, and then they just coded them if they saw them as being combined. But this just shows that what is divisive at one level is often unifying at another level. And so this kind of brings in questions of how do we prioritize our relationships, and is the divisive always necessarily negative, or in what cases is it actually a positive thing for other relationships? And the majority of, some accounts were highly divisive, the majority weren't. They were kind of just that separating of us and them and that division. So we should focus more on diminishing these more harmful divisive interactions. And one thing that might provide a good solution is contact theory, which is this idea that the more you interact with people of different faiths or different cultures, the more positively you'll view that culture. And that is everything. Thank you.
All right, so in a little Utah play on words, I called this the cornography crisis, after the pornography crisis that our state has been going after. A little bit of Utah Mormon humor there.
Is it the down arrow?
The down? Okay, thank you. All right, so a little background on how I started this. I'm from kind of I guess you call the breadbasket of Idaho, just kind of the southern area along the Snake River Valley. And we grow a bunch of things. We're famous for potatoes, but another thing we grow a lot of is corn, actually, which I'll get more into. And basically what happened is one day, I'm not shy, I'm not afraid of debating a little too much. Somebody posted on Facebook, we've all kind of encountered this, and it was a young man I knew from my husband's hometown, which is near mine, and he'd been interning with some legislators, and he was just basically saying, oh, I'm a little surprised at some of the changes we've seen among the more like conservative Republican side, away from more of free trade arguments or not as much intervention in the economy to more intervention and free trade, as President Trump has kind of lauded some of these things. And as a result, a lot of his family kind of became attacking him. I rushed to his aid because, again, I'm not afraid of debates, a little too much. And I brought up that some of these families, most of them in his family were farmers, and they were directly benefiting from some of these things. And that if they really were fans of free trade and non-interventionism that they've been critiquing with Obama in the past years, then perhaps they should try to forgo some of these programs or to fight against them. And I was not received well in that aspect. I actually found out later this was one of my mother-in-law's best friend's family that I got into this with, so I ruined my social and political capital in one day in this small town, much to my mother-in-law's dismay, but she's a very nice lady, so we moved on. And being as neurotic as I am, I decided to turn this into an entire project for a data visualization class I was in, because I did not want to be proven wrong, and I wanted to show it visually. So I decided to study the effects of corn subsidies on the health and wealth throughout the world, and just how these subsidies don't only affect American citizens and the American economy, but us being kind of the economic juggernaut we are, our public policy affecting others throughout the world. So I started just looking at farm subsidies, and I knew corn made up a big amount, but I did not know it made up almost 50%. And I also found that corn and soybeans, which constitute the biggest blocks of the farm subsidies programs, are planted at a loss, actually. So these farmers initially plant them. They expend more money between, oops, my heel just snapped, sorry, between the fertilizer and the nitrates for the soil and such things and the farm labor. They end up planting it as a loss, but as the subsidies come in, sometimes in forms of their insurance or even just direct cash payments, depending, they end up gaining money, which is why they do it. And corn subsidies alone, which make up almost 50% of these almost $9 billion subsidies, are over $4 billion just in themselves. And so that actually shocked me. I also found out that cotton subsidies are also very harmful. But that's for another day. So just looking at corn subsidies over time, I was kind of shocked to see how volatile it could be. Some things that affect it were elections, as well as the economy, as well as just general public policy, kind of ebbs and flows depending on the popularity at the time, especially with presidential elections, as the Iowa caucus is so important, and corn is very important to Iowa. In fact, Ted Cruz kind of had to step back a little bit during the Republican primaries when he first was a little harder on the corn subsidies when he realized it was affecting his numbers. He did eventually do well in Iowa as a result. And I graduated with an African Studies minor. And I am always interested in how that affects just the developing world in general, particularly Africa, what we do in the United States. So I decided to look at the effects on wealth globally, especially in some of those areas in the global south, and how it affects them. So just looking at this just shows corn production by country. I looked at per capita estimates, but the picture was pretty similar, and I wanted to show the sheer bulk of what we do in the United States. The United States is far ahead of anyone else in the corn production that we give, even though we are not primary agricultural, especially compared to some of these other regions where most people's job is a farmer, whether that's just subsistence farming or more for a profit. And I found that the United States is doing much more than these other groups, and that sub-Saharan Africa and kind of the western side of South America are some of the areas, despite having such large amount of farming in their economy, they were not producing a lot of corn. And so then I decided just to kind of compare this, if you can remember the last picture, just with a compared advantage. So just a quick economics refresher, it's just the ability of a country to carry out particular economic activities, such as making a specific product, such as corn or cotton, more efficiently than other activities. So you'll want to specialize in a production depending on your opportunity cost compared to these other products, and you'll want to import those other products. So just basically what you're most efficient at, not necessarily what you have more people like able to do even. And what I found essentially is that even despite like NAFTA, which should allow for more free trade between us and Canada and Mexico primarily, the United States still, just because by the sheer amount of our subsidies, is ending up sending things to Canada. I'll talk about the health effects on Canada and Mexico later. But just through that area, despite that having largely agricultural areas there, the United States is still doing that, and it is affecting some of these other areas that have a large comparative advantage trading with the U.S. economy in corn. They're actually, some of these developing countries are coming to import corn just as their more processed foods are being made. Which leads me a little more into the effects on health. We have an average Joe here eating some corn. And I started wondering, when we subsidize things, we're pushing more of that into our economy usually, and we're promoting it, such as subsidizing vaccinations can lead to more vaccinations, just taxation often or other penalties will do the opposite effect. So I was wondering, how are these subsidies affecting us here in America and out in the world? I was pretty shocked to find. I found out you can take a strand of hair or several strands of hair, and you can analyze what % of your food comes from different, from corn or potatoes or whatnot. Something I didn't know, as I'm not a biologist or a geneticist. But one doctor found just in his own hair, 69% of his diet came from corn. And I found some other people that had theirs tested, and it would go up to 80%, kind of fluctuating. With that large amount of corn actually in our diet, which doesn't make a lot of sense if you just think about the normal things you eat. You think of a hamburger, for instance, but many hamburgers actually have their beef patties padded with corn, especially when you eat fast food, surprisingly enough. I don't know about Wendy's. They claim to be 100% real beef, but and yeah, the typical grocery store has more than 4,000 items that contain corn in some way, shape, or form. Commonly, it's high fructose corn syrup, which is what makes ketchup a little bit sweeter, and especially your soft drinks a little bit sweeter. I purposely picked Fresca during the refreshments, so I didn't feel hypocritical, as it contains no corn syrup. And then I just kind of looked at like the history on the United States. We did have a bit of a transition. You'll see in the earlier part, past 1950, as we kind of grew in a country post-World War II, after the baby boom. There were different sugar alternatives, some that had health consequences, and some that are still being debated on that. And there was also a shift from more sugar beets and cane sugar over to this high fructose corn syrup over time. And what we saw largely is that this increased intake is from different experimental studies, longitudinal studies, was leading to the increase in obesity that we've seen, what we call the obesity epidemic, to go along with the cornography crisis. And you see corn consumption going up, not as a sheer amount of what we think of sweet corn that we eat or just on the dinner table as you spoon up, but just from soft drinks, sugars, even the bread you eat is largely sweetened a bit more with this corn syrup. I mentioned what I call the WHO meta-analysis that basically went through over the past several decades and looked at consumption and linked those together, as well as some experimental studies in that meta-analysis showing that sugar consumption, which has largely been driven by this high fructose corn syrup, has really led to much of the obesity we see today, along with the sedentary lifestyle. There are also rat experiments where they'll give them different doses of high fructose corn syrup and see insulin responses that lead to obesity and different types of diabetes. And it is, of course, a study on rodents, but a lot of this can transfer to humans as we consume that same product. And then also an interesting study just completed within this last year that found that NAFTA, which I mentioned before, has had negative health consequences on Canada as the sheer amount of cheap corn and high fructose corn syrup has flooded into their country. So it's also kind of affected other countries we're feeding to. And it's even starting to develop, countries that are starting to develop a little more. Some countries in Africa are starting to see this among different populations as they start eating those highly processed foods with that sheer amount of high fructose corn syrup, because the corn produced abroad is now becoming cheaper than some of the fresh fruits and vegetables produced within their own country. And there was another I saw about Mexico, but it was less conclusive, so I did not cite it. Some concerns about, sorry about the S that got chopped off there. Some concerns about affecting this, about getting rid of corn subsidies, though. First of all, elections. I mentioned Iowa. That's a big concern as Iowa caucus comes so easily. And other areas like Kansas and Nebraska and even my own Idaho would be largely affected if we were to take away the corn subsidies. So any promises to do so on the count of different legislators or the president are going to be met with a lot of resistance that could affect re-election. Another issue is farming. Many farmers have become dependent on these. It would create a big lifestyle change as well as a change in the different machinery used and the crop rotation, which is important for the soil. Another issue is the food supply. We become very dependent on this, especially low-income people often rely on foods that include a lot of this corn syrup or cornmeal to basically feed them, even though it doesn't have quite the same nutritional value. In fact, a lot of the cereals we have that have corn, they've been adding vitamins into, because without it, it is largely similar to a dessert. And the other issue is the history of evidence coming from our different dietary sciences. Sometimes we found that we think cholesterol will be an issue or saturated fat will be an issue, and we're coming to see more and more the play between genetics and different things. Right now, sugar has become a large culprit, and while I'm led to believe that evidence, especially with the high fructose corn syrup and the different meta-analyses, I am concerned at times that if we shift ourselves too much on a path one way dietarily, we may find out that was for nothing and waste a lot of money and resources in the process. Despite that all, I do think there is a good case against corn subsidies, and thank you for your time.
Okay, so my presentation is titled Refugee in Salt Lake Valley, and I will be discussing cultural enclaves. And so my research, I'm an anthropology major, and my research involves, it was an ethnographic study of 2 Iraqi refugee families that were recently resettled in Salt Lake City. And by recently, I mean they were resettled this year in January. And I met them when they had been here for about 4 months. And so my research took place over the summer throughout the course of their integration, and I really enjoyed getting to know them. So I wanted to share this quote that came from the Board of Advisors for Utah Refugee Services. It says that approximately 1,200 refugees are resettled in Utah each year and there are 2 main resettlement agencies, Catholic Community Services and the IRC, International Refuge Committee. So it adds to nearly 60,000 refugees who currently call Utah home. And of this group, approximately 99% of the refugees in the state of Utah are resettled in the Salt Lake Valley. So it has become densely populated by refugees, the Salt Lake Valley, over the course of the years that it has been common to resettle them here. And this adds also to an already dense immigrant population in the Salt Lake Valley as well. So my research, in the middle of my research, I became very interested in public perception of refugees, because this year especially has been very common discourse to talk about refugees. And so I interviewed a little under 100 Utah residents. I surveyed them, and whether they were supportive of refugees being resettled or unsupportive, generally I found that about 65% agreed to the question that I asked, which was refugees should learn to conform to the rules and norms of American culture and society as soon as possible after they arrive. And so that kind of shows that there is kind of a popular consensus, despite what your beliefs are about refugee resettlement. There's a popular consensus that refugees should learn American culture and be able to integrate in that way soon after resettling. So some things that Utah residents have been saying, and I received from my poll. I have two quotes here. One respondent said, "They do not help us to accept them when they stick to themselves and do not socialize or mingle with non-Muslims." And another respondent said, "I feel that they are not being resettled equally around the United States." So in reference to this and kind of acknowledging that there is a little bit of an enclave that has been created with the resettlement agencies focusing on Utah, Salt Lake Valley, Salt Lake County to resettle refugees, it's important to note, so when I say enclave, I'm referring to a distinct cultural or social unit that's enclosed within a territory. So it's a group of people enclosed that have something in common. And I'm sharing this quote because it's also discourse not just within Utah, but around the country. This is something that a leader has said about enclaves and just the concern about resettling refugees all together in one area. He said, "When you have so many immigrants being admitted, they tend to cluster together. They tend to maybe be a bit more slow in learning the English language, to becoming acculturated, to becoming patriotic Americans." So this is a common discourse that you can find, but especially I found it within Utah. And so this concern is common. It's there. And so ironically, there is research that shows that enclaves are useful and helpful for immigrants and refugees to be able to better acculturate to their community. And so research has been done. I want to focus on research that's been done by Dr. Jacob Hickman. He's actually a professor here at BYU, an anthropology professor, but he focuses his research on Hmong refugees, and so that's his area of expertise. But what he's found in his research is that enclaves are useful when you bring a group of people that all speak the same language to one area. They can help each other to learn kind of the ways of how to learn the language, buy car insurance, learn how to pay rent and find a job and stuff like that. So that's kind of just his research. Enclaves can be extremely useful for these people. And when it comes down to it, it says that second generation refugees or immigrants in general can pick up on the culture and become integrated. They can be considered as integrated. And it's especially seen in schools as young children of the second generation. Young children gain networks and learn the language and grow up with other children that are American and speak the language. They're able to become fully integrated. So with my research, I noticed that in the Utah Valley, as I've mentioned, we expect refugees and immigrants to acculturate and integrate, but there are certain policies and processes that encourage the formation of ghettoized enclaves. So not useful enclaves, but more separate. So that's what I'd like to discuss a little bit today with the short time that I have. But I want to mention a disclaimer real quick, because there are, through my experience with these families, I've recognized there are many useful services that are offered for these families that are recently resettled here to help them. The purpose is to help them to acculturate and to quickly get jobs and learn the language. Not necessarily in that order, but I'd like to share one extremely useful means of acculturation that I have been able to see with both families. The mothers of both families, upon being resettled here, within 6 months, they were given jobs at the DI, Deseret Industries. And so I'll explain that real quick. As you can see, in 2009, the Humanitarian Center Project was created to teach English and job training to 150 individuals, and this is continued even now. And so it's the Department of Workforce Services will refer certain qualified applicants to work for this Deseret Industries as a job. And so for the first half of the day, you will receive language training, and you'll also take a class that's meant to help you integrate. So you can either learn how to better budget, how to get a credit card. Also, you can take classes that will prepare you to get a driving license eventually. And so a lot of money, as you can see in this graph, is dedicated towards helping refugees overcome the first initial challenge of integration, acculturation. So, but back to cultural enclaves and kind of the challenges within the DI with both these women that I'm close to. I can see that they spend the majority of their day there, surrounded by employees that they're working with. And these employees are also in the same shoes. They're either refugees or other kinds of immigrants that have been referred with them to work there. So that's where they build their friend groups. They don't really have the means or opportunity to go outside these networks that they're creating here. And the same thing happens with the children in schools, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So when I talk about ghettoizing the enclaves, I want to be clear that I'm talking about the historical definition of ghettos, which is when, like referring to Jewish ghettos, where a quarter of the city was specifically designated for the Jews to live, and this would isolate them and it would limit their opportunities. So they kind of just had their own little group, enclave, but it would be extremely limiting in their experience and being able to be a part of the larger community. And so no one really has the resources to get out of that situation. And I also want to clarify that the refugees, the experiences that they've had, that I've seen, they accept the resources that are given to them, but it's very limited because their day is spent in such limited means where they can't really reach outside of their day-to-day activities. So I want to explain two ways in which I've noticed ghettoization of cultural enclaves in Salt Lake City. One is the welfare snare. So when refugees are first resettled here, they are given food stamps and other cash for the first 6 months to help them pay for rent. And also they're given language classes to go to in hopes that they will learn the language enough in those first 6 months to get a job. When they come here, any prior experience they had, especially education, it does not count here. So the father of one of the families, he was a manager at a mall of over 800 employees. He was the manager, and that experience doesn't really transfer over here because he can't speak the language and do the same kind of thing. He was also a private accountant. He had his own accounting business, and his accounting education does not transfer over here as well. So he can't come and be an accountant unless he went back to school. So he's kind of in a snare where the only job he can get is a job based on his limited English skills, which is usually low paying. And so despite the resources given to him from the government and for both these families, despite these resources for the first 6 months, they don't really have a means of overcoming the snare that they're in. And so that typically refugee families, when they come here, they stay in lower paying jobs, and they don't really have the means of, as you can see, this is a monthly budget of one of the families. Now, I should say that this budget was not given to me, but I knew the family enough to know their expenses each month, so I kind of created it. But at the end of all their bills, they only really have $36 of savings. So if you think about how that savings plays into being able to get out of the neighborhood that they're in to a nicer neighborhood, it's very, very difficult. And the final example that I wanted to use is both families that I worked with both Iraqi families. They have 2 children. One is in elementary school and one is in high school. And they both are having similar experiences as they are going to public school. So when they first come here, the nonprofit that resettled them directed them to a public school to go to, and it turns out that both those public schools, the vast majority of the students in their classes are either refugees as well, some Arabic speaking, but not all of them Arabic speaking, and then other immigrants. So that's the majority. There were only a few native English speakers in their classes, which creates a very difficult dynamic when you're trying to learn the language and also network and create friends and connections, because not everyone speaks the same language. So it offers a little bit of a ghettoization in that way, where you're kind of closed off and you have limited opportunities to grow. So one of I helped the high school son of one of the families to transfer schools, because I think he recognized that he was having limited opportunities where he was, and he was told by his one friend that he has, which is also Iraqi, he was told that this new school in Salt Lake, this other one that he wanted to transfer to, had more opportunities for college, and that where he was, he would not be able to go to college. And that also offers a lot of refugee students, when they come over here, they have limited paperwork to show the experiences that they had previously before coming to the United States. And if you can't prove through some form of report card that you've completed certain credits and you've reached your senior year of high school, you might not get your diploma. And there's also, it's not common to be able to be held back to get that diploma. So a lot of refugees, if they're older and they're coming here, if they're like high school age, they will finish high school without a diploma, and that also limits their experiences. So to conclude, cultural enclaves are very useful and very helpful for refugees and immigrants, but specifically from what I've seen, these refugees, they're very helpful for building connections and being able to get by the very basics of survival, learning where to go to buy food at the store, what public transportation will take you where, and how to get there. Connections will help you buy a car, and neighbors that you know will help fix the brakes for very cheap. So these cultural enclaves are very useful for basic survival, but what's happening within these enclaves, it needs to be also happening outside the enclave. There needs to be a change in how maybe we enter the enclave, so that there can be more connections and experiences made for refugees to be able to better acculturate. But thank you.
Wow, let me say how impressive you all were. That was just fantastic. I'll start off by saying, Sierra, I know nothing about subsidies, but and I have no comments for you. Just a fantastic presentation. I learned a lot. Thank you. Claire, that was a wonderful presentation. I knew very little about ethnography because I was trained as a number crunching social scientist, and I did not know what ethnography was until a few years ago, when I was forced to do ethnographic research with battered women. And it was unbelievable. And then later with prisoners too, because it gave me insights that I never had from all the number crunching I had done earlier. So great job, wonderful. And I'm going to be brief because we don't have much time left. Kelly, where's Kelly? There she is. Enjoyed yours too. I think you're onto something by looking at what unites and divides, and I'm sure you've seen Putnam's book, American Grace, who's also written at length about this topic. So just a couple of things. For 2 decades, I've criticized measures of religiosity as being too limited, arguing that we need more measures, more multidimensional measures. We still do. We've studied everything from how one views God now. Do you have a benevolent view of God or a judgmental view of God? And how does that, forget church attendance and all these other variables. But the reality is, after reviewing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies, it's hard to beat church attendance. It really is. And so one of the things that I think would be helpful if you pursue this research would be to see how the measures that you're using are related to or not related to more traditional measures of religiosity. And then the last thing about what, you're talking about what unites and what divides us, I'll remind you that, as if you needed it, I don't, the gospel itself is divisive. It's offensive. When you read the Bible, it offends you. It has to. And that's why some people outright reject Scripture. And so it's kind of funny when someone says, you mean you believe this and this is a sinful act? And it's much worse than that. All of these things are sinful acts. It's very offensive. So I think as long as we study religion, you're going to find that it can be divisive. The last thing to say is that most of the time when we publish papers, we're looking for effects. Which way they go doesn't matter. If it's positive, so be it. If it's negative, so be it. I've done a lot of data analysis, and I publish studies the way they come out. Only one time have I found an effect that was counterintuitive, where religion actually caused some harm, and it was because I think the program was designed really poorly that I was studying. Other than that, I find it positive. I have often hoped and even prayed that it would go the other way, because I would probably win a lot more awards if I could find that God was a problem. But because academics are really anxious to publish that, it's when you find that God is good that you have difficulty getting it published. That's been my experience, at least.
So I'd also like to say thank you for the excellent and very thought-provoking papers. So well done. For Claire, thank you for your work on an important topic. I think in our globalizing world, migration is a big topic, and the movement from areas of danger, people moving from areas of danger to areas of security. You might be interested in looking in Bauman's work. He's written about globalization with human consequences, looking at the migration of people and how that's driven by power inequalities. So perhaps consider the sort of the context that's leading to the movement of people looking for more security in their lives. I think you did a really nice job looking at how society tries to integrate and some of the challenges faced, and perhaps try exploring those a little bit more. So considering what can we do as a society to make people feel welcome generally. So I know you've probably heard in Canada we've taken many refugees as well. This is also in Europe. They've taken thousands and thousands of refugees, and they're working through ways of helping people to integrate and find meaningful lives. So you might want to do some cross-cultural comparisons and look at how Europe and Canada are handling similar types of topics. So for example, we're seeing students in our classes in Canada who have post-trauma stress disorders. So trying to find ways of helping those students cope as they go through those experiences. So thank you for that. For Sierra, I really enjoyed your inclusion of statistics and research. Oh, and sorry, I wanted to mention also, Clark, you might also enjoy looking at David Hansen and his work on globalization, and he talks about having a cosmopolitan outlook where you look at reflective openness at the same time as you have the reflective loyalty. So kind of having a dual lens, a way of thinking about how we help people integrate, but at the same time respect the strengths of their cultural backgrounds. Sarah, I really enjoyed your inclusion of statistics and research. I thought you had a really good example of a case study exploring power inequalities. and how these are influenced by government policies and the impacts that it might have on individuals, such as health effects. You might be interested in looking at Vanessa Andreotti's work, and she looks at global citizenship, post-colonial theory, and a little bit of how these inequalities have actually developed over time, so both through colonialism, for example, and she has a really good critical lens. So she deconstructs a little bit about how global citizenship can be a continuation of Western colonial mindsets. So perhaps have a look at that and the impacts in a global sense, and then perhaps what are some of the things that we can do to address these issues. And Kelly, interesting and relevant topic. I think we can all relate to our families and the struggles and dialogues that we have within our homes together. I think it was interesting that you look at both the negative and positive discourses or dialogues within the family up to the community level, and perhaps consider dialogical theory. So how a negative discourse doesn't necessarily have to be negative. So you mentioned the same thing. It sort of relates to our own open-mindedness. So you might be interested in Hare's work, and he wrote a book on what open-mindedness means. There's also Baba's work on building overlapping consensuses, Dewey on dialogue as learning. So for example, divisive discourses, depending on the mindsets of the people who are there, might actually be enriching. If you can, so I always appreciate people who think differently to me, because it really stretches the boundaries of my own thought. So think perhaps through that, how these differences might actually be beneficial to building deeper and more thoughtful relationships. So how people handle these discourses might be important. And also, how do we handle them from a personal level up to a social level? So if it's the case that people feel other religious groups are divisive to them, what are some of the things that we can do perhaps as a society to address some of those differences? But good job, thank you.
You did a very nice job, well presented, really interesting. I'm going to start with Heather, right? I was very interested in your talk. You this morning, at noon, put up this slide, all the negative effects that the public has, and said none of these are true. So I thought, wow, this is great to have a paper that actually looks at whether some of these negative effects may be true. And I agree that God is good, but in our human frailties, can we use our human sin? Can we use the good God in a bad way? So that's why I think it's important to take a look at this. I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make as researchers is we look at average effects, and sometimes that masks different effects in subgroups of the population. So it may have a positive effect in one, negative effect in another. You get an average effect, which isn't true for any subgroup of the population. So I think it's important. I think your paper is really important to just take a look at that, regardless of how the findings come out. And I, too, would kind of wonder how she defined religious families. You know more about that than I do. That would be helpful to know, the extremely religious families. And I thought you did an extremely nice job with this PowerPoint. You had just about the right amount of data, nice pictures, it was easy to follow. I think these are very hard to put together. I thought this was really a model of getting the right amount of information. It was clear what you were going to cover, so I wanted to congratulate you on that. I was interested in this thing on the cornography now. This is outside my field, but I know policy. So I liked the slide where you cited the meta-analysis that you use, the experimental analysis, because as I discussed this morning in my talk, having accurate information is very important to policymakers. So meta-analysis are extremely helpful to policymakers. They don't have time to look through a lot of studies, but to have someone who has scientifically looked across a number of studies, because the whole policy process works on trust and giving out good information. You give out bad information, you lose the trust of your colleagues, you lose the trust of your constituents, and you lose your ability to be effective. There was one slide where I thought maybe you couldn't have a little stronger evidence. but I don't know. Maybe it was just you didn't put it on the slide. You talked about the doctor that found 69% of his data and gave a CNN source. And then another source that was in Iowa.org. Be a little more careful about those. You did such a nice job of this at the end. I try to use that type of data when you're making an argument for a policymaker. And I like the way at the end, you said what some of the concerns are. I always think when I'm speaking, the best defense is good offense. You are better off, I think, saying out what some of the counter arguments might be and then reacting to them, rather than have it come from someone in the audience. It looks like you didn't even think about it, that you didn't think about what some of the counter arguments might be. And you did a very nice job of laying out some of those concerns. I thought that was a very good technique. There's a couple other downsides of corn that I think you might look at. You know, when you plant corn, the way it's planted now, there's a lot of runoff off of this corn. A lot of pesticides are used on this corn. It runs off into the streams and ends up killing frogs, bees, butterflies, honeybees. So there's a lot of downside effects beyond the health effects on the environment and there's the erosion effects. There's like, because of the way, even with no-till it's a little bit better, but even with no-till there can be a lot of erosion effects. So that's another reason why we might want to be concerned about the pornography crisis. And the refugee one, very, very nicely done. You caught my attention right away. I like that first slide from the Board of Advisors to say how many refugees supply. I thought, wow, this is an important issue. It's important to start with that. Why is this important? Otherwise, nobody's going to listen. Right? So you've got to get that out right away. I thought you did a very nice job on that. I like the you talked about the humanitarian center and the placement rate, 65% job placement rate. What would have been helpful, I think, that sounds high to me, good, high and good, would be to know what is the average placement rate in some of these programs. And particularly maybe is there any evidence in this area, because it may be affected by like how many industries you have. So that could have strengthened your argument a bit to say how it compares to others. And I really liked this budget that you did. There's a new book that's getting a lot of buzz in policy circles, The Dream Hoarders by Richard Reeves. And he's talking about the upper middle class, the growing divide between the upper middle class and everybody else. And the upper middle class doesn't really understand what it's like not to have enough money or not to have enough food. And I thought this budget was really a very nice way of showing it. I mean, anybody can look at this and say, could I live on this? The other important policy point, when I looked at it, 25% of their income went for taxes. And this is a common thing we hear in policy circles, the poor aren't paying any taxes. Why should we be giving them services? They're not paying any taxes. 25% of their budget is taxes. So I thought that was an important nice job. Here you go.
I know we're at time, so I'll be mindful all the time and keep my comments very brief. But I just want to start everyone, Mrs. Kelly, Mrs. Davis, and Mrs. Willerson, I thought your presentations were excellent. I thought your topics were timely and more important, just very relevant. So congratulations on selecting good topics. And overall, I thought everyone made great use of evidence. You presented very well articulated arguments. And congratulations on providing very polished presentations. So overall, I thought everything was excellent. And I definitely encourage everyone to continue this research as well. So if it's high quality, then it'd be great to see you continue this level of research. And just a few comments for each of you. Mrs. Kelly, I think, when you mentioned in the divisive nature of religion, you mentioned orthodoxy and, quote, disagreeing on doctrines. I just encourage you to dig a little bit deeper, as was mentioned earlier in the panel. Gospel scripture is, if not intentionally, divisive, right? Let's hear more about that. To what extent do core teachings of particular religions, such as stances on homosexuality, and what this may do to a family and a family's extended family. It'd be great to hear you expand upon the idea that participants are being judged for religious beliefs, and what do you mean by that exactly? And what are some specific teachings that we can learn from that are causing this division? And then also this raised a question of, when you concluded with the idea that we need to learn about other religions and sort of help sort of create a more common, united culture, to what extent is world religion taught in schools? And I think if you look at that issue as well, you begin to see that there's a lot of resistance to teaching that world religions course in public schools, and the question there is why. Mrs. Davis, beyond the excellent picture of G.W. Bush eating fantastic fun. I'll also draw, looking at that, got me thinking about George Bush Jr. And I wonder when we had that slide about the global implications of corn production, I noticed that there was a spike in corn subsidies under George W. Bush, right? And at the same time, I know there's an increased aid to Africa, and he's actually very well liked and received in Africa because of foreign aid. So I just wonder, could you put this in a post-colonial context, or could you put this in a context of globalization to help us understand what are the global implications? Because if elections were a key finding, well, what does this mean for in a global context, especially in the George, because he seems to have had an impact, but we don't hear much about the corn production and what this could possibly mean. And I hear a lot about the sugar debate in cities. I know Cook County is currently debating a proposal. I think they voted on it yesterday, but to overturn the ban on sugary drinks in the city of Chicago. And I know this is highly controversial, but it's made me think about corn and corn syrup. And in the 80s, and McDonald's had to get rid of their, I think, it was a corn syrup, right? But they got rid of the production of their French fries. To what extent do corn and corn syrup-based products intersect with the expansion of capitalism, and how would this affect a movement to remove so many corn products from our diet? And is it impossible in a capitalistic society? And Mrs. Willardson, again, excellent topic. I really like that. I don't like it necessarily, but I think it's a poignant quote by Lamar Smith that captures this narrative of cultural deficiency. And just to encourage you to think more about enclaves themselves, because enclaves, I feel like, imply a de facto segregation, and at least historians and a lot of sociologists are beginning to question de facto segregation, to say that, well, people aren't necessarily choosing to live in these enclaves or essentially segregated communities, because there are certain policies that city councils, largely white, middle, and or upper class, impose on immigrant communities or communities of color. So what are these policies that, while there may be certain benefits that people experience in living in enclaves, what are the policies that maybe limit their decisions? So is an enclave truly a voluntary decision, or are there policies that we don't see that are rendered invisible that actually help create these enclaves as well? And again, this is related to the point about public education. There's another quote. If they're going to live in America, they need to learn English, which I think is a common sentiment in the United States. But at the same time, to what extent is Arabic, for instance, taught in our schools? Why aren't we offering Arabic as well? If we were expecting immigrants to learn English, which I understand, right? But if we're creating a cohesive society, will we not at least offer Arabic to English speakers to help to make integration and assimilation a two-way process as well? But excellent papers, and it was a pleasure to hear them.
Thank you very much for your critiques. Thank you to all for participating today. Appreciate it.